works of Cecil Alexander. We had 4 guests planned today. Art Harris could not be with us. We have 3 great guests with us, and I want to start out by thanking them for donating their time. I know they're very busy to come here today and speak with us. I'm going to read a quick biography about Cecil Alexander, and then I'm going to pass it on to Tom here, who has been the person spearheading this. It's his brainchild. So I want to thank Tom also. Without him, it wouldn't be possible. We wouldn't be here today. So.
Tom who?
Tom Brooks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom Brooks. Our summer reading theme this year, summer reading is not just for children. Our summer reading theme is to build a better world. And Cecil Alexander is a great example of someone who built a better world, both through his architecture and through his civic work. And so that's what we're going to be, our guests are going to be talking about today. Cecil Alexander was an architect, civic leader. He built many iconic buildings around Atlanta. He built the Coca-Cola building. Yeah, he built the Roundhouse, which is on Mount Perrin Road, which is about 2 miles from here. It's not far away. He also built the Coliseum. The architect. He didn't build it. He was the architect for the Fulton County Stadium. Thank you very much. And many other buildings around. He started his education at Georgia Tech. He was there for about a year, and then he transferred to Yale, where he got his undergraduate in architecture. He then moved to MIT and did graduate work in architecture there. He took time off from that to go fight in the war. He was a bomber in the war and did over 60 missions and was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross twice for his service. After his service was over, he came back to school, went to a little university named Harvard, and got his master's there in architecture. And that's when he started his distinguished career as an architect, building the buildings that I mentioned earlier. But he also had a life of a civic life as well that was very active. He fought for equality throughout Atlanta. He was on the committee to mediate racial unrest, and he also formed the Black Jewish Coalition with civil rights leaders, and also late Congressman John, and later U.S. Congressman John Lewis. He served on many committees and groups under various Atlanta mayors. We have with us an Atlanta mayor, former Atlanta mayor today. He also received the American Institute of Architects Whitney M. Young Jr. Award for improving race relations, the Ivan Allen Award for community service, and the Yale Medal for distinguished alumni. Mr. Alexander appeared and popped up in many places as a librarian, as a reader. You might be interested to know that he was the character in Pat Conroy's novel, The Great Santini. Colonel Hudspeth was modeled after Mr. Alexander. And Mr. Alexander was also in the movie Driving Miss Daisy. So you see him throughout history popping up in all kinds of things. He led a life that touched many people throughout history. And we're here today to hear some of the stories and what he did to make the world a better place. With us today are also 3 people who are also committed to making the world a better place, who have also served their communities, and we are very honored to have them at the table speaking with us. I'm going to turn it over now to Tom, who's going to be our moderator. He's going to introduce our guests.
Thank you, James. And we have some questions prepared, but this hopefully will turn into a true conversation when we welcome your input as we go along, as many of you knew Mr. Alexander well. Our guests are Sam Massell, president of the Buckhead Coalition, former Atlanta mayor, and I believe it's 4 careers: real estate, travel agency, public service, and association management. Is that correct?
That's very good.
And likewise, Doug Alexander, Mr. Alexander's son, has multiple careers and former Atlanta City Councilman, marketing and PR. He's a transportation expert on large and small scale transportation. And also, Wright Mitchell is an Atlanta attorney and the founder of the Buckhead Heritage Society, and also Emory Law School.
Emory Law School grad.
And before that, he lettered in as quarterback at the University of South Carolina.
Yes. Done your research.
So as we know, the overarching question for all three of you is why does the community need to know the life of Cecil Alexander and how did he build a better world?
Who wants to take that?
Sam?
Well, I'm delighted to join this group and pleased to see so many of the family members here, or relatives. What you didn't know is I'm one too. Probably didn't realize it. My sister married into the Solomons family in Savannah, which made me by marriage a member of the family. So I'm proud to claim that and hope it's not questioned before the program ends. Cecil was in my life in many ways throughout various stages, and certainly set the pattern for building a better world, and is one that we can all try to emulate for more and greater progress in the future. Even though back as a teenager, part of his family lived down 3 or 4 doors from me on St. Charles Place. When I became a realtor, as was mentioned, he was in his prime, starting as an architect, doing some great work in Atlanta. I was with Allen Grayson Realty Company, which handled most of Ben Massell's properties, and Cecil did the Peachtree 7th building, which is still standing, and many of you would not realize, even looking, it was then GSA, Government Service Administration, federal occupancy. Now it's turned into a condo building, like many have been converted. But it was the largest office building in Atlanta at the time, 500,000 square feet. It doesn't look like it because it's not a tall building. In fact, for a little trivia interest, my uncle met with the representative for GSA to talk about doing the building, and he sketched it out on a napkin in his office, and the GSA head framed that and kept it in his office because that was the beginning of, like I say, a major building, 500,000 square feet. There's not many more larger than that in Atlanta today, but it wasn't a skyscraper, but it was called Peachtree 7th and still is. When I became president of the Atlanta City Council, of course, we had many relationships. He was on the well, to begin with, as was pointed out, he was the architect for the Atlanta Fulton County Stadium, and the City Council had the contract with him to do so. He was with a group of others that did that building that served us so well for so many years. When I was president of the council also was when we started the Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority, and he was very active in that, in the Speakers Committee, appearing throughout the city, promoting its passage, which failed during that period, but at least it got the concept started of having mass transit and that kind of mobility for our city. Now in my work with the Buckhead Coalition, I've still been related step by step with his activities. As you know, he was the one given credit for, much of the credit for getting our Confederate flag taken down at the Georgia governor's governorship level, and replacing it with one that he did that served for 2 or 3 years before they revised it again. But during that period, he also, well, not during that period, but shortly afterwards, for the Buckhead Coalition, he did our flag. We have a Buckhead flag that he designed because I felt he had become an expert on that. what that not many people have done, and it's a beautiful green flag. I mean, you know, he was creative, he's artistic, he had ideas that he could add to what we were trying to do to bring out the quality of life in that community. As I just pointing out all through these years, I felt close to him. I was pleased to help through the Buckhead Coalition in some of the funding for Burmese Bridge down the street. And I think the best way to describe Cecil, and I won't take more of your time from the panel right now, but to explain that this was a very important period to our lives in Atlanta and Georgia, because we went through, in the 60s, early 60s there, and throughout the 60s, the transformation of our city from an all-white power structure at City Hall to a black government. And without incident, without the troubles and problems that some other cities had, and that's not by accident. And so I was proud to be there with Cecil, but he was what I would call one of the young Turks at that time. He's 10 years older than I, but like John Portman, who did the Peachtree Center downtown that saved downtown, frankly, at that time, like Jim Cushman, who did Carly Square, who was so ahead of his time with a major mixed-use development like that, or like Tom Cousins, who saved or transformed the East Lake area from a crime place, criminal place that now is a mixed-use, livable community. And others. I mean, if you, at that time, remember watching television news and what was happening in other cities, and the Bull Connors in Birmingham and people like that, they were the older people who had a different mindset entirely, but it was these young guys, and Cecil was one of those young guys who led us in the right direction and set the tone for our progress and prosperity. So I'm very proud to talk about him and be here with this audience.
Wright Mitchell, I'm an attorney, and I'm the former president of the Buckhead Heritage Society, and Buckhead Heritage Society's mission is to promote, protect, and preserve Buckhead's historic resources. And actually our executive director is here today, Carmi McDonald. Her husband, Mark McDonald's head of the Georgia Trust. And so kind of my background, my relationship with Cecil, because Cecil and my grandfather were contemporaries and friends. And then my father and Cecil served on, my father was on the, at the time, was the Board of Alders, I think, wasn't it? Alderman, Board of Aldermen. And so he and Cecil served on a number of civic committees together. So Cecil was always kind of a family friend, but more my grandfather and father's friend than my friend, of course. But I got to know Cecil primarily through my interest and our interest as an organization in Burmese Bridge, which is the bridge across the Chattahoochee down there by the front gate at Lovett. And that bridge was threatened on 2 different occasions, and Cecil stepped in on both occasions and basically single-handedly saved the bridge. And it's a great story, and I think it's a story that ought to be told here today. I think maybe rather than launch into it now, just kind of give a brief overview of my relationship with Cecil, and then maybe tell the story as it comes up. Maybe someone could ask, why don't you tell us the... Maybe Carmi could ask that question, and I'll tell it, because it's somewhat of an involved story. But so, Cecil actually was also a neighbor of mine, and lived just around the corner. And back in when the bridge was threatened the second time in 2006, I had some conversations with Cecil about how we at Buckhead Heritage could be helpful to him in raising money to refurbish the bridge. And I would go over on Sunday afternoons. He lived on Rivers with his second wife, Helen. And I lived just around the corner, but I would go over on Sunday afternoons and just sit and talk to him about it. And, you know, we would talk about the bridge and how important that was to him, but also just talk more broadly about, you know, some of the things that Sam touched on, civil rights. You know, he was very much involved in the civil rights movement in Atlanta, was Mayor Allen's kind of point person to kind of go out and be the more progressive face, I think, to that administration than what, you know, had previously been kind of the public posture of the power structure at that time as it related to race relations. And talked a lot about, you know, World War II and his history as a dive bomber, and just, I mean, so many, just truly a Renaissance man. And so we ended up, another Buckhead Heritage Board member and I took Cecil's oral history. We have an oral history program at Buckhead Heritage where we'll sit down with people from the community and basically just record their recollections about growing up in Buckhead. And so we spent 2 days with Cecil recording his oral history, which was a fascinating experience. And so, you know, I became kind of although of course, you know, many generations difference between the two of us, but really came to view him as a friend, as much as somebody that you know, I was trying to help, you know, save a historic resource in Buckhead. So, you know, I was certainly honored to be asked to participate on this panel. And you know, I think it's for my generation, you know, a lot of those things that happened in Atlanta are so far removed. You know, it's the distant past, and many people don't, you know, it's just not on the radar. So I think it's great what the Cobb County Library System's doing, and kind of highlighting Cecil's contributions to Atlanta, because they're legion. And so I'm, you know, honored to be here today and look forward to talking about what, you know, Cecil meant to me, and you know, all the good work he did, not only in Atlanta, but with the bridge just down the road.
Well, I'm Douglas Cecil Alexander, and I have a slightly different relationship with him than pretty much everyone else in the room. As his son, I certainly saw him from a different perspective, but one of the things that I always knew is that Dad had a vision. Sometimes it was about his legacy. He wanted to be Harold Rourke from the Fountainhead. That's how he imagined his life. That he wanted to be the master architect, who would be, everyone would all other architects would bow at his feet. That didn't quite work out the way he hoped. But that's what he was very much about his vision, particularly his vision for buildings. He lived in the built environment. He worked so hard in the human environment, though, and he worked so hard, I mean, working with people to get things done outside of buildings he designed. But he didn't think of it that way. That was just what he did. When you mentioned the civil rights efforts that he had, he was very involved in making sure Atlanta understood that the color that mattered was green and not black or white. And most of the city leaders and business people came to understand that that was what was important. Leb's was an exception. And there's a letter he wrote that's at the Bremen that I hadn't seen before to Leb about it, and unfortunately kind of fell on deaf ears. But for the most part, he in conjunction with so many others that were working for this, were successful. But in the mid-60s, I mean, he got used to the phone ringing, picking it up, and getting death threats. Then one day he got a death threat from a judge. I don't know who it was, but Dad said that he identified himself to Dad and then threatened his life. Dad went out and bought a revolver the next day, which he kept for a long time. When it came into my possession, it was a sodden, rusty mess, and it really creeped me out, and so I disposed of it. But the fact that he had gotten people that upset meant he was making some progress, I thought. The thing that I always, one of my frankly dearest memories of him, we're driving along Peachtree and about to turn up on Peachtree Battle. And I was saying to him, Dad, the real effect, you know, the biggest effect you've had in the world are all the lives you have touched. I have talked to so many people who remembered him when they were young associates at Fabrow, and that he took a special interest in each young associate. And when he was just out doing his thing and helping people, and he was very, very, very engaging and helpful to folks, and just offered a hand to listen or to do what he could to assist them. And I said, your biggest effect, Dad, the legacy that you will leave behind is that of all the lives you've touched. And he said to me, I wish I could believe that. And that, I've always thought, how sad. Because it was always about, when the Atlanta Fulton County Stadium was imploded, he said, I've lived too long. It took him another 15 years to actually live too long. But he hung in there, and I'm glad he hung in there, or he wouldn't have had the whiff and poos come and serenade him and things like that. And maybe, I hope, towards the end of his life, he came to understand that it's about the people and not about the structures that really matter. And I think that he would love the fact that we were here. I know he'd love the fact that we're here talking about it, because at his heart, I'm sure I'm not telling any secrets when I say he was a classic narcissist. But that can be a tremendous motivator towards doing good and doing great things. And I think in his case it certainly was.
And in reading his autobiography, I'm kept thinking over and over about how there was real communication with people, and that, like, here we are, it's rare to be eye to eye, now we're so often, right? It's just full of relationships. Can you comment on that how things have changed in the civic arena? It's really interesting, like, there were people that he would comment on them being late for meetings, and you know, he really kept track of people, I'm trying to say. Very people focused, as you said.
Well, he was very involved and, to my knowledge, never turned down a civic request. Of course, you know, there's just a very fine line between civic service and political service. In civic service, it's where they ask you, will you serve on this committee, will you be a member of this board, and they don't pay you anything. In political life, you ask the people, will you let me serve you, and they give you a stipend. You know, otherwise they're very much alike. I mean, before being president of the Atlanta City Council, I was president of the Atlanta Humane Society. I don't mean to equate those, but
No, there's some relationship.
yeah.
No, good. No,
But I mean, really, you're working to, you know,
Working with animals.
to do with the group that the group can't do individually. And civic service is such an important part of our city, and we have the group I work for now which is in its 30th year almost. Is a nonprofit civic group of business people in the Buckhead community with a mission to nurture the quality of life of those who live, visit, work, and play in those 28 square miles. And, you know, y'all can admit I'm here today, but I didn't spend any money outside of Buckhead. I don't want to get caught. But it's a very important part of our community. And you know, you keep in mind that every time the civic service is performed, it's probably something that otherwise you would have had to pay taxes for. And you don't if they're volunteers and others who are giving of their time and talent in the civic community. So Cecil was definitely front and center in that arena. And, you know, we're to be pleased. Doug, you brought up labs, and I'm going to share, if there's no objection, a story that maybe only 8 other people know, but it will be in my book that comes out next month. It's October, I think it's coming out. Seriously, let's play it again, Sam.
Les who?
Naturally, great name.
Les who?
Leb's, as in
Leb's Restaurant.
LED,
LED, apostrophe S.
It was a delicatessen downtown.
Peachtree and Forsyth. It's an interesting story in civil rights, at least. Harry Belafonte was in Atlanta to perform a concert here, and they were staying at the Atlanta Cabana Motor Hotel, which was at Peachtree and 7th, right across the street from the office building we were talking about earlier. And he called City Hall to ask, or his staff did, could he have dinner in the restaurant. Now this was in 1968, I think. I was president of city council then and also had the title of vice mayor, which meant I was acting mayor if Ivan Allen, my predecessor, Ivan Allen, was out of town, which he was. So I got the request. It happened that in real estate, I had sold that land to clients of mine, so I knew the owners of the hotel. And I called Stanley Mallon and said, you know, is it okay if Harry Belafonte and his entourage have dinner there tonight? And he said, well, it's certainly okay with me, but you have to check with the restaurant because they're the tenant there. And the restaurant there was the Knights Inn or something like that. But it was one of Charlie Leb's restaurants. Now his main restaurant that Doug was talking about earlier, it was downtown at Forsyth and Lucky Street, a very large, successful delicatessen. But anyway, at this place, he had a regular restaurant. And so I called Charlie, who I knew in business, and asked him the same question, and he said no. And I spent maybe 20 minutes and talked him into yes. 2 minutes after he hung up, he called right back and said, no, I've changed my mind, no. We went through that procedure 3 times to where he finally refused to let him eat there. You know, we promised him a plainclothes policeman, we promised him that Mr. Belafonte wasn't there for a demonstration, he was there to eat dinner. There wasn't any, I think partly Charlie was scared. You gotta put yourself in the frame of mind now in 1968. Not 2017, you know. Things were different, and he was scared. But he was also a racist, and there was no question about that, in my opinion. So anyway, he turned it down. That word spread to the Atlanta University Center overnight, and the next day the students went to Lucky Street and Forsyth and put Charlie Leb out of business. It's an interesting bit of trivia. You know, one thing that y'all didn't mention, I'm glad to say, is much as we're bragging about Cecil, he did have one bad egg. He had an uncle, is it, that ran as a Republican? I mean, would you?
Harry Alexander,
Harry Alexander.
and served as a Republican.
Yeah.
On, yeah, he was, and it was hilarious. I came across.
Hilarious.
Well, it is in retrospect. I came across a card that he handed out. I've got a couple of these, and it, you know, it says Henry Alexander for what was it, state senate or something like
Yeah,
that.
state
And it said, in support of Wendell Willkie.
Yeah. Well, you see now, you called him two names, Henry and Harry. and he
Well,
had two
Harry,
names.
we called him Harry,
Yeah,
but
I
his name
know.
is Henry
I
Alexander.
knew about him. He had a great big billboard, which was probably against the city ordinances, right there on Peachtree. He owned the property where Phipps Plaza is now. That's where his home was. His home really impressed me. It had 13 bathrooms. But can you imagine any home having 13 bathrooms? It was big. But he had a big billboard out front when he was running for office
Well,
on Peachtree.
He also had a big billboard that he supported. It said, "Re-elect Ike and Dick." And,
I don't know about that.
and it was right there where the entrance to the Buckhead Loop is off Peachtree now. That's where it stood. And Dad and Mom and Terry and Judy lived in a little house just a bit further north on Peachtree, a little white frame house at the time. And somebody overnight vandalized it. So that
sign.
the sign, so that it read "Re-erect Ike's Dick" in the morning. And Uncle Harry had it fixed immediately as soon as he saw it, and then gave his yard man, who was probably in his 90s, he sat him there with a rifle, just sitting there right there by the sign to protect it. Dad was concerned for Terry and Judy, particularly. This fellow couldn't see the broad side of a barn anymore, and he had a weapon. He's sitting there with his weapon in his lap, and Uncle Harry assured him, "It's okay, Cecil, he doesn't have any bullets." It was more of a threat, but that,
Cecil's real name incidentally was Harry.
he originally was born Henry Alexander. He was named for his uncle, who at the time was serving in World War I, and there had been some thought that he might not come back. And so when Dad was born, they named him for Henry, for his uncle. And then Henry came back, and then later married a Russian emigre, and they had a son who they named Henry. This is Dad's 5 years old, and there's now 2 Henry Alexanders in the family, and well, that doesn't work. So at age 5, they renamed him Cecil after his father, Cecil Abraham Alexander, who then was Cecil Abraham Alexander Sr., and Dad became Junior. And the story that my mother used to say was Dad was not happy about this at all. And he demanded in his little 5-year-old voice, "Name me Hemi." He did not want to be Cecil, but he got over it. Pretty much everyone called him Alex until Terry's son was born, whose name is Alexander. And I do remember once my mother yelling for my dad, yelling, "Alex!" and both Dad and Alexander Milky saying, well, there was "Yes, honey," and "Yes, Grandma" at the same time. So then he sort of had to accept being Cecil again.
That same year that he lost his name, he broke his arm and they switched him from being left-handed to being right-handed.
Oh, my goodness.
So he had a tough early childhood.
It could explain a great many things.
Yeah.
I'd forgotten about that, that's right.
That's a
His dad forced him to become a righty, which explains why he didn't. He wanted to be a professional baseball player, and he got as far as college baseball, and he was a catcher. And he didn't appreciate that the catcher kind of runs the game, whereas the pitcher just throws the ball to the catcher. But he had a great story that one day there were apparently the strike zone seemed to be very fungible with this particular umpire. And I found this to be a tremendous story, apocryphal story about dealing with people in leadership who you don't have much control over. Because at one point he turned to the umpire and he said, "Just where is the strike zone?" And the umpire looked at him and says, "Anywhere I goddamn want it to be, kid."
Wow.
And that was that. And perhaps I think he learned a great deal from that experience.
It's really just impossible to cover so many of his highlights. The Atlanta The Milwaukee Braves coming to Atlanta, that was a milestone. Can you comment on?
Well, he was, as Doug and other, and Wright had mentioned, I think that Cecil was very close to Ivan Allen, the mayor, and, you know, each respected the other and served each other well. There was a good arrangement, not in an official capacity, but just through their friendships. And of course, Ivan Allen was responsible for bringing us professional sports at that time, and so Cecil was very supportive. But I want to switch to one other thing that needs to be told before I forget, because it's, I think, one of the most beautiful things he did in life that's very little known. Maybe even Doug doesn't know. But when the Leo Frank case evolved, and our governor then, Slayton, commuted this sentence. I'm not sure if that's a technical arrangement that, a change that he made, but rather than the sentence being death, it would be life in prison. There was a march on the governor's home in Buckhead, which is near what's now Slayton Drive, near the Atlanta History Center, Slayton and West Paces Fair, where Governor Slayton lived. And there were mobs of crazy people coming to Buckhead to the governor's home. And Cecil went and sat with the governor.
Actually, I'm afraid that was Henry. That was Henry, the elder, his uncle.
The Republican.
Dad, yeah, the Republican. Dad was
Oh,
a
I
child.
can't say so.
Dad was a child when that happened, I don't think.
Yeah.
If Uncle Harry was a lawyer, and he actually was a
Well,
part
I
of
think better of
Leo.
him now.
Yeah, he was he was part of Leo Frank's defense team,
Yeah.
and they spent the night with the governor while this mob was
At his
outside.
home.
Yeah, at his home,
Yeah, they didn't have a governor's mansion. Well, if they did, it was in,
Milledgeville.
it wasn't.
Well, it was down on Pride, it was down at Ansley Park.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Oh, I remember that.
But Slayton had a house on Slayton.
Interesting.
Yeah. Of course, Leo Frank, as y'all probably know, Governor Slayton commuted his sentence, and the folks from Marietta didn't like that much. They went down to Milledgeville and got him out of the jail down there and took him back and hung him in the courthouse square. And as you know, as evidence, and there's a book by Oney, O-N-E-Y. Steve Oney?
Steve,
Yeah.
it's a friend of mine.
Who called the name of the book?
And the Dead Shall Rise?
The Dead Shall Rise. It's
Yeah.
the most kind of in-depth analysis of that whole case. And it was, he was convicted on flimsy evidence, and it was, in all likelihood, the night watchman at the pencil factory that had committed the murder. But the interesting thing to me was that the anti-Semitism in Atlanta at the time, the night watchman was an African-American.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You know, but the anti-Semitism in Atlanta was such that they would rather have focused on Leo Frank, you know, who was the manager of the pencil factory, than the night watchman who, you know, if you weren't kind of colored in looking at things, colored by whatever your bias might be, you know, everything pointed to the night watchman. But Leo Frank was convicted wrongfully, and I think Slayton knew that, you know, and that's why. But he was not gonna turn him loose. You know, that would have been political suicide. So he commuted the sentence, and then very prominent families from Marietta, where Mary Fagan was from, was the victim, went to Milledgeville and took him back to, and the people, you know, in Milledgeville, the jailers just kind of stepped back. The fix was in, so. But another very interesting, kind of sidebar of Atlanta history.
Well, it's interesting that so many stories get shortened or mistold, if that's the word. Doug and Terry, the change of the flag, there's the notion, a lot of people think it happened just like in 1 year, but I think your father had his flag in his briefcase for 7 years and was showing it to folks.
I think it was about that amount of time. A few years before that, Dad and I went to the second march on Forsyth County. I think we were in one of 30 buses coming up from Atlanta.
I marched with
Yeah, that's right, we were there. And I carried a state flag that was from before 1956. It had been given to me years earlier by Judge Luther Alverson, because I've always had a thing about heraldry and flags and everything. And this gorgeous silk flag that had stood in his chambers until they took it out and put in the one with the battle flag on it, and that would have been done in 1956. And so I took that as, I carried that flag, and I had so many people ask to carry it for a moment, just to hold it. And I came back with the idea that we need to go back to the flag we had before 1956. And so I started an organization called Georgians for the Flag. I got pilloried by the Klan for doing this, which made it even better. And then Dad designed his, and at one point he came to me and says, "Why don't you give up on yours and work with me on mine?" And I said, why don't we just agree that we want to get the flag changed? And he didn't think that was good enough, but and so he continued on, and there was a moment when it looked like Governor Miller was going to get the flag changed back to the pre-56 flag during his term, except that he then said during his speech, "If you're not for changing this flag, then you are a racist." And I'm like, you just killed it. You just killed it. And I think he may have done it on purpose, but along comes Roy Barnes, and my dad and Roy were good friends, and Dad took this flag to him. He had he'd had Atlas flags, which is now I think over on Chattahoochee Boulevard. He had them make a special flag for him. I think it cost him like $300 to do just a one-off flag like that. And he took it to the governor, and the governor thought about it for a week, and then just in a lightning stroke put it on the desks of the legislature and said, "This must happen now." And it did, and it shocked a lot of people, and it, and there were a lot of people, including people who are, I forget what the title is, the Latin word for people who are into flags. They have a magazine, and they did a review of it, and they weren't very happy with it because it's too balanced. Flags need to have a weight on one end. A lot of people said it made a lovely placemat, and I think it would. But in addition, we were all so proud of Dad when it happened. I remember the day it happened. I got a call in my office at City Hall. And he said, "We're going to put the flag up." And so I made calls to everybody I could think of and got out there. And we were all out there as the old flag came down and the new one went up, and it was a fantastic moment. And I happened to be up on Lake Burton a few years ago at a meeting, and I happened to see somebody, they're one of those houses up on the lake, they're flying that flag still. And I'm like, Lake Burton, how about that? And there was a wonderful story at the temple. The temple was flying Dad's flag, or the Barnes flag, as it's often called, and refused to put up the new flag that we got under Governor Perdue. And somebody from the governor's office called and said that the flag had been changed by a vote of the legislature, and so they had to change the flag. Well, the way heraldry works, if it has been a flag of your state or your country, it remains a flag of your state and your country, even if you've moved on to other flags. It's like you can still fly the Betsy Ross flag, and that's a flag of the United States.
You can't change history.
No, you can't, as much as you'd like to. You can rewrite it all you want, but it's still what it is. And so they said, no, we're not going to. But no. And the folks at the temple were very pleased that they had ticked off the governor's office that thoroughly.
Can I add a brief thing about
Sure,
this?
please.
Yeah, with his design background, I think he was tempted to do like a beautiful flag, but he was more interested in getting it passed. And for that reason, there were all these older flags at the bottom. He said he got some letter from somebody said it looked like a dog's breakfast. but there was a reason to this, and it wasn't just for the attractive design, it was to make it more politically acceptable.
Yeah.
Because he felt it was so important that it happened.
Yeah, and we talked to him about that during our oral history interview, and he said just that. He said, I wasn't out to design a flag that appeals to whatever those folks are called, the Latin term for flagophiles, but he said, I just wanted a flag that was neutral
Yes.
and represented all the different interest groups, and it was just a
Because it's
placeholder,
so-
basically.
Yeah, because it was important to
Yeah.
have. Now, the Buckhead flag's beautiful,
It's
It
beautiful.
is.
but it didn't have that agenda with it.
Yeah, he actually was trying to design something that looked good, and he did.
Yes, I wanted to say one other thing, because people have mentioned Burmese Bridge, and I'm not sure everybody knows that Hermie was, our mother was his wife.
Yes.
And on it, it says builder of bridges, because she also was
Right.
a builder of
And
bridges between people.
The bridge was originally saved by her as an effort when the state came and built the new bridge. They were going to tear down the old one, and she made it her mission to save that thing.
And Wright has written about.
Yeah,
Yeah, so,
so let's get into
yeah,
it.
all right,
I'll
well,
let you
I'll tell
go.
the Hermes Bridge story. I know there's a question there, did you wanna?
It was the bridge question to the bridge.
Okay,
So please
to the
tell me
bridge,
about
right.
that. And you mentioned Lovett School in relation to that, and I'm not quite sure where Lovett is, but is it in the vicinity of the bridge?
Right next
Yeah,
door.
It's right on,
Come out of here, take a right and go down the hill.
Okay.
just inside
1
Fulton
mile.
County.
As you cross it over the Chattahoochee, you'll be on the modern bridge, but to the left of it is a blue steel truss bridge. It was 19, I want to say it was 1918.
18.
No,
1912, I think you're right.
Yeah, but it
1912.
it
Let's
it
just
was-
split the difference.
It was the, and
Early 1900s.
so kind of the history of the bridge is that, and Jillian Greer was here earlier, I don't know if she's still in here, but she's head of the Vinings Historic Preservation Society, so I'm glad she's not here, so she can't correct all the wrong facts. I'm gonna tell you now. Hardy Pace's Ferry, had a ferry that ran, across the river, and that was the way that you got across from Fulton County to Cobb County back in the day, or at the time, it was probably Campbell County, and, it's not always been Fulton County. But at any rate, it was the way that you got from the south side of the river to the north side of the river, and vice versa. You would put your, wagons on a ferry, and Hardy Pace or one of his assistants would kind of, pole you across. Or it probably was a pulley system, I imagine. That's how you got across the river. And eventually when more folks started needing to get back and forth across the river in the advent of the automobile, they put up a permanent bridge, and that was the bridge that's down there now beside the modern bridge. And Cecil, as a child, recalls going down there to that bridge and playing underneath it when it was in the early. When was Cecil born?
1917.
Okay, so
18, I'm sorry, 1918.
in the early 1920s, mid 1920s, but even as late as the mid 1920s, there was still evidence during the Civil War there was a pontoon bridge that had been built there in 1864 for the federal troops to cross. And there was still evidence, Cecil saw the remnants of this old pontoon bridge that was still there from the Civil War in the Chattahoochee. But so, Cecil's earliest memory of that bridge was playing underneath it as a child in the Chattahoochee. And then, as he got older, it was a one-way bridge. So if you wanted to get from Fulton County to Cobb County, you had to wait till the Cobb County folks came over, and then you could go across, and so it was a
riding my
one-way.
bike across that thing, and I'm scared to death, because there
Yeah.
was somebody on my tail. I'm on my bicycle, and I'm trying not to fall off those two strips there. It's like,
Yeah, it was a one-way
one-way.
bridge, and there was actually a racetrack over there if you go across on the left, and the embankments are still there. There's a road if you go, I don't know the name of the road, but that first road that runs along the river, you go down that road, you can still see the embankments of this racetrack that used to be there. And it's also where you got your, not that Cecil got any bootleg whiskey, but that's
No,
where you
of
got
course
your
not.
bootleg whiskey. But so Cecil talks about going across this bridge, and so he had, exposure and attachment to the bridge. And then in 1972, the bridge had become antiquated and outdated, and they wanted to tear it down, and they were going to put up the bridge that's there now. And Cecil's first wife, Hermione,
Not Hermie.
but
Or
her full
Hermione,
name
it's not
was
Hermione. Hermione Wheel.
Yeah.
Not Hermione, as they say in Britain.
Right. She, in her own right, was a very accomplished civic leader, and was involved in the civil rights.
Oh, absolutely. And there's a lot, I think Terry would agree that she was a lot of the, shall we say, the impetus for Dad's involvement, realizing that we need to do something, and that he could be in a position to get something
Right.
done. And so she helped him move that along.
They went to
We were
she
together.
encouraged him to go to Fulton County, Board of Commissioners, and convinced them that it would be less expensive just to leave the bridge in place than tear it down. And so they built the existing bridge right alongside of it. And then, tragically in 1982, I believe it was, Hermie and Cecil were coming home from a Yale fundraiser on Mount Perrin in their home, which is still there now, and is a fine example of modern architecture. It's called the Roundhouse, and that kind of bears touching on. I think we actually have the current resident of the Roundhouse here. Is that right? In the back, too. So both of them.
And they've done a fantastic job
Yes.
with it.
So I'm not an architect, but I understand it's one of the earliest and one of the finer examples of modern architecture in the city. But Cecil and Hermie were returning to that home, and they were struck head-on by a 16-year-old drunk driver, and Hermie was killed in that accident, and Cecil was badly injured. And he tells the story that he was in the hospital recovering, and that the head of the Fulton County Commission at the time, whose name escapes me, came to visit him. Michael Lomax came to visit him in the hospital and said, is there anything that we can do for you? And he said, I want you to rename that bridge Hermie's Bridge. There was a renaming ceremony at some point. When would that have been? It was well before
Well, it wasn't.
2006, I think, right? Or
Oh,
was it-
yeah.
Yeah, well,
It
it
was-
was,
in the
was the
mid-80s.
renaming
Yeah.
also kind of the dedication to it? Dad was in the hospital at the time of Mother's funeral, and he couldn't be there.
Right.
And so we had a dedication of the bridge to Mom, and he hired a bagpipe player, which he loved bagpipes. Mom hated them. But he had that bagpipe.
It was his show, he could do what he wanted,
And they-
and she wasn't there to object.
They put up the plaque that's there now.
Mhm.
I remember that day pretty clearly. There's a wonderful picture of Dad and me together from that. What I think is particularly interesting is that Fulton County went and did all that at that time. And then when the bridge was again endangered in the early 2000s because of frankly, it was being undermined by the river. In addition to the fact that it hadn't been maintained, it was deteriorating. It turns out the thing belongs to Cobb County. It never did belong to Fulton County. But Sam Owens, who was the chairman at the time, and a good friend of mine before he even changed parties, was a friend of mine. He worked with Dad and me, and we got, he found the funds, got some federal funds and some county funds, and fixed it up. And had a rededication ceremony a couple of years ago, and so now it's back to being able to be used by people, because there was a time
But
you
it was
didn't want to
closed.
build that.
And it was so, and he also, so at this time Cecil would have been in 2006, how old was he?
102? No.
He
He was in his late 70s.
That'd be older
His
than that.
80s. He was in his 80s.
So he raised a fair amount of private funds
Yes.
as well. And our conversations at Buckhead Heritage with him related to who might be a possible source of additional funds to rehabilitate the bridge. So he saved it, not once but twice. And it's been, a staple of, not only kind of the history of this area, but also, Lovett used to be that students would park across this river where the canoe is, and they would walk across Burmese Bridge to class. And a lot of people have, fond memories of doing that. So, we also like the fact I went to Lovett some by it, but we also like the fact it's painted blue. I'm not sure that was intentional, but.
What that was when they were scraping all the paint off, that was the very first color
Was
they
it
came
really?
down to. That was the original color of the bridge.
But it was also Lovett, I'm sure.
I'm sure, right.
Oh, we got that later.
You can believe what you want.
Well, one
It's
thing,
fine.
because the roundhouse is such a kind of, and Cecil was more of a commercial architect.
Mhm. But he did a number of houses, not just ours. He must have done 5 or 6 different houses.
Talking about commercial work that he did, I don't think you mentioned that he did the Peachtree Baker building for the Internal Revenue, which was also for my uncle Ben Massell, but it was the first, what they call window wall construction.
Curtain wall construction.
Yeah.
He tried to get it saved because of its status as the first, but its status also as having been the home to the IRS didn't help it any.
Y'all didn't mention his airplane that he owned with Ted Levy, another architect, that biplane, was it?
Yeah,
He
extremely
would fly it
biplane.
around, and, I'm glad
Oh,
he
yeah.
quit
He would-
doing that.
He would never fly, he would never take me up in it. He was afraid that if it went down, that was the end of the Alexanders, so, at least the name.
Yeah.
And,
I
but
apologize,
I didn't have-
I'm gonna have to leave, like I had told y'all. In fact, we mentioned, I did a few times about Ivan Allen, his daughter-in-law, Ivan III's widow, funeral is today. So I have to leave for that, I'm sorry.
Thank you for coming.